Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum viewers. Today we are talking about a very interesting topic, and we have been joined by two international experts and one of our very senior risk assessment expert from Islamabad. So we are discussing Israel, Zionist regime, and the future and the legitimacy of state of Israel. So to discuss that, I will request Mr. Tauqir Ahmed to introduce our first guest, Mr. Elias. Sir, over to you, sir.
You are asking me?
I will ask you a question in a moment, but let me say something in Urdu first for our view. Then we'll start questioning. अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, पाकिस्तान में इस वक्त काफ़ी अरसे से एक बहस छिड़ी हुई है कि पाकिस्तान को इजराइल के साथ अपने ताल्लुकात सफारती और तिजारती सतह पर इस्तवार करते हुए इसे तस्लीम कर लेना चाहिए या नहीं। आज हम इस मौजू पर बात करने के लिए हमारे साथ मारूफ जर्मन स्कॉलर और मिस्टर बॉब फ्रॉम कनाडा भी मौजूद हैं, जो एलियास डेविडसन साहब हैं। इन्होंने कई किताबें लिखी हैं और इनमें सबसे इनकी जो मशहूर किताब थी वो 9/11 और मुंबई 26/11 के मुतालिक थी। एलियास डेविडसन खुद एक जूइश घराने से ताल्लुक़ रखते हैं और इनके ख़यालात जानने के लिए इनसे हम कुछ क्वेश्चन करेंगे। जबकि ये भी मैं बताना चलूँ कि जनाब डेविडसन पिछले साल पाकिस्तान भी तशरीफ़ लाए थे और इंडियन फॉल्स फ्लैग ऑपरेशन में हमारे मेहमान खुसूसी थे। इस कॉन्फ्रेंस में इन्होंने बहुत सी बातें की जिससे पाकिस्तान में भी और दुनिया भर में भी लोगों को पता चला कि 26/11 का एक्चुअली जो मसला था वो क्या था। Thank you for giving your time, Mr. Davídsson. You are a warm welcome on this interview. My first question to you is, please explain the difference between a Jew and a Zionist to our viewers.
I'm sorry. Thank you for your invitation. I hear you quite badly, Mr. Tauqir.
Okay, can you explain the difference?
Could you increase the audio?
Mr. Elias, let me repeat the question for you. Mr. Tauqir is asking, please explain the difference between a Jew and a Zionist to our viewers.
Well, first of all, I usually don't use the words Zionist or Jew. I use rather the words Judaism and Zionism. Both are one. Judaism is a religion. Zionism is the political ideology. So a person who is adhering to either of that could you call Jew or Zionist, but this is a difficult thing to call a person something. So I rather talk about the difference between Judaism and Zionism. Judaism is a religion, one of the three monotheistic religions like Islam and Christianity. It is not a political ideology. Zionism is a nationalist ideology which was established at the end of the 19th century by people who were of Jewish descent. They were not religious Jews, who believed, like many Europeans, that Jews should have a particular state of their own. They had the idea or the legend that Jews worldwide were a nation in the sense of French, German, and so on. This was, of course, an invention because Jews were not a nation. They were a religion, exactly like Christians and Muslims. They're not a nation in the contemporary sense of the word. And the Zionist movement at that time was in the very minority among the Jews in Europe. They had to fight because they were really ignored, and they were combated by most Jews in Europe because most Jews in Europe had emancipated and got their human rights in European countries as equal citizens of the particular nations. So my family, for example, they lived in Germany and they considered themselves as part of the German nation of Jewish religion. and so on and so forth. And it is normal that most Jews opposed Zionism because it undermined their rights as equal citizens in their own countries. So Zionism, as I said, is a political ideology, which ended with the establishment of the State of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. So moving towards you, Mr. Robert, what would you like to add in the definition that Mr. Elias has, how the way Mr. Elias has differentiated between Zionism and Judaism? What will you add in it?
Well, that was a very clear description. I want to add just another component. There are Israelis, there are Zionists, and there are Jews. A person can be all three, or they can be one of the three or two of the three. Someone who lives in Israel is an Israeli. If they're Jewish, they're an Israeli Jew, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily Zionists. Zionism, as Mr. Elias has said, is a political movement. It is not one that has a tremendous amount of popular support among the international Jewish community. We can, as an example of that, we can see that in the most recent U.S. presidential election, where Donald Trump, who has done everything possible to please the government of Israel, did not receive the majority of the Jewish vote within the United States. His opponent did. So this is, Zionism is an ideology. It is not one that is supported widely by people of Jewish descent. There is a movement within a conservative Jewish community internationally to quietly and peacefully disband the State of Israel because they believe that it is in violation of Jewish principles to have their own nation. So these are fairly clear distinctions, but sometimes do become confused in international discussions about Jewish religion, the political ideology of Zionism, and someone living in Israel.
Thank you. So, Mr. Tauqir, now I think your voice, there is some problem in your voice that we can't hear you. Sir, we are unable to hear you. Mr. Elias, I'll move to you with my second question, that how and why the State of Israel was created.
This is a very big question. Let me begin why it was created. There are different theories about it. One theory is that the Zionist movement was very powerful and got its message and could force or could pressure different countries to support the idea. Another theory is that the British Empire wanted to create a bridgehead in the Middle East for the West for controlling the Arab countries. And they saw the Zionist movement as a very useful tool to create that bridgehead. And therefore, in 1917, Lord Balfour gave its very famous Balfour Declaration, where the British Empire said that they see with a very good, they see with a positive eye the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But this Balfour Declaration was an example of huge deception, because every sentence in that Balfour Declaration is deceptive. So on that ground, the Zionist movement got a kind of a blank check to build up this state, which was defined as a homeland, but it was in fact intended to become a sovereign state. This was one of the part of the deception. So the State of Israel was essentially built to secure the British Empire. And then the State of Israel became a bridgehead for US imperialism. So if you ask me about the why, it is basically a tool of imperialist policies. However, the imperialist policies until today use the State of Israel as a tool to keep the Arab countries under the heel of the West. This is how, this is a question of how. Now, if you're asking how it was done, not why it was, how it was done, this is really much simpler to answer. The why, the how it was done is very simple. The Jewish Zionist forces expelled the majority of the Palestinians by military means. They destroyed 385 villages of Palestinians and basically made room for the Zionists to create their own state. Without the expulsion of the Palestinians, they could not have created that state.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Now, Mr. Robert, I would like to know from you if you would like to add some point in Elias' answer, and most importantly to our next question, is the legitimacy of the state of Israel. What do you think? Is it a legitimate state or not?
That's a very interesting question. Most nations have been established through the destruction of the indigenous people who lived in them. Think of the United States or Canada, for example, who drove out the people who had been living there. So Israel is the same. It's the example is the same. It drove out the Palestinians who lived there, as Mr. Elias has mentioned. Whether or not it's a legitimate state today is an interesting question, because it exists. It's not going away, but it is certainly a rogue nation in the United States. The government of Israel has no respect for international law, has no respect for human rights, and most of the world community, especially the United States and some other nations, are complicit in its crimes, in its violations of international law and its crimes against humanity. So any nation that behaves in such a terrible way towards people that it has been occupying for decades, one has to question its legitimacy as a nation, because it is certainly an apartheid nation. It is one that is brutally oppresses the people of Palestine, and also anyone who is non-Jewish within its borders, within its and many of its borders are certainly illegitimate, because the United Nations unjustly established it on Palestinian land with certain specified borders, and Israel, for the past several decades, has, almost since its inception, has violated those borders by stealing more and more land from the Palestinians. That land must eventually be returned to the Palestinians. Whether or not the original cruel action of the United Nations will be undone, I would say is unlikely, but Israel must be forced to adhere to international law and to respect the rights of all the people within its borders, and to keep its borders what they were, rather than further destroying Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. Thank you for covering this up. But here comes for both of you, Mr. Ellis, Mr. Robert, and Mr. Tauqir. There is an interesting fact that 160 out of 191 countries recognize Israel in a way, or have trade relations in another way. So what is this about? And mostly, if I would say that countries who don't have any kind of terms with Israel are Muslim countries. So what do you think about it?
Are you asking me?
You may please start.
Well, I'd like just to add a couple of words about legitimacy. I make a distinction between moral and legal legitimacy. Israel has no moral legitimacy. Now, if we consider that from that point of view, I completely agree with the former person who you interviewed. Israel has no moral legitimacy. It is created on the basis of a crime. However, we should also add that the United States and Canada have also originally no moral legitimacy, but they have in some way compensated that fact by according to all the natives equal rights, while the state of Israel has not done so. So Israel is not only morally illegitimate, but also illegitimate in sense of human rights in the international law. And this is a big distinction between the United States and Israel. I just wanted to say that. Now, about the fact that many countries, many states, many governments recognize and have dealings with Israel, this is just a question of opportunism. International relations are not a moral game. They are not, international relations are not carried out on a moral ground, but on a ground of interests and opportunism. So there is nothing particularly special about the fact that many countries recognize Israel and have dealings with Israel. But we as citizens must take these things a little bit different. We are not running countries, we are not governments, we are individuals, we have a morality, and I think we have to uphold this morality. And in doing so, I would like to say, I have family in Israel. I'm concerned personally about their fate. And I think that peace cannot be achieved without justice and without legitimacy, without morals. So basically, the peace itself, and I don't expect any country in the world to create peace or to bring peace in this region, because governments have interests. Those who are committed to peace and to justice are those who will help us. And those are to be found within the borders of that country, Palestinians, Israeli Jews, and all those who support that kind of thing in other countries.
So, Mr. Robert, your take on it. Thank you, Mr. Ellis.
On why so many countries have recognized Israel. It is a political and financial opportunism. The United States supports Israel with billions of dollars every year. It has for many years and will for many years to come, based on agreements that have already been made. And other countries want to take advantage of a technology that is developed in Israel. They want states mainly. And so these other countries are not concerned with human rights, as Mr. Davídsson has mentioned. So they just want to profit, they want their governments to profit. Secondarily, they might want their people to have some benefit from this, but mainly they want to be powerful on the world stage. We see that countries repeatedly will compromise their own principles for a financial gain. If I could just refer for a moment to the United States violation of the JCPOA with Iran. Once it violated that agreement, it told the European signatories to that agreement to stop trading with Iran. So this is a case where those countries agreed with the JCPOA. They wanted to support it, but in order not to sacrifice some trade or some other agreements with the United States, they also violated them. It went against their moral beliefs because they believed in the agreement, but the profit motive and the power motive took precedence over their moral beliefs. It's the exact same with countries agreeing to trade with Israel. They want the benefits, financial and in terms of power, that doing so will give them. It has nothing to do with many of them have condemned the Israeli violation of human rights and international law, and yet they don't put any force behind those condemnations because they continue to recognize and trade with Israel.
Mr. Robert, sorry to interrupt you here. In continuity of your answer, I would like to add, I would like to throw my next question is about the recently UAE and some other Arabic countries have established diplomatic relations with Israel. Although Pakistan was also asked by them to not to have any relationship with Israel due to Palestine issue. It's a very conflicting and interesting phenomena that we observe, that Arab countries ask Pakistan not to have good terms with Israel, but at the same time they're establishing their relationships with the state of Israel. So, what are your views on it? How they think of Palestinians, and especially you work in for Palestinians' right. So, what are your views?
There is a certain level of rather astounding hypocrisy when a nation will establish relations with Israel and ask another nation not to do so. The Arab nations, I believe, want to keep some sense of legitimacy regarding their position on Palestine. They pay lip service, perhaps we could say, to supporting Palestinian rights, and then they violate Palestinian rights by trading or allying with, establishing relations with Israel. And by asking Pakistan not to, they're hoping to hold off the complete annihilation of Pakistan, but they want someone else to do it. They don't want to take the moral high ground. They don't want to sacrifice the benefits that trade with Israel might bring to them to do what is right. So therefore, they will establish these relations with Israel, but will encourage others not to, in order to assist the Palestinians, yet they are not themselves willing to help the Palestinians.
So, Mr. Tauqir, what would you like to ask our distinguished panelists?
My question is, it is widely believed that Israel is working on a greater Israel plan. What is your opinion about it? Question to both of them.
I think Israel does have a greater Israeli plan. Israel wants to completely destroy Palestine and occupy all of it permanently. It's interesting that Israeli government spokespeople will say how the governments of Palestine want to destroy Israel when they have no power to do so, and yet Israel is on a daily basis attempting and succeeding in destroying Palestine by stealing more land, killing more Palestinians, building more illegal buildings, and so on. So Israel certainly has this greater plan, has a view of having the entirety of Palestine as its own. It has been successful to date, but we have to see that the things have been changing. The BDS movement, for one, has taken much more support now. The Israeli government is investing millions of dollars to combat it. In the United States, several states have outlawed BDS, which is certainly unconstitutional within the United States. Also, for generations, both the Republican and Democratic parties, the main two parties in the United States, have supported anything and everything that Israel wants to do. That has changed. There is a growing voice, a growing segment of the Democratic Party that opposes Israel, that opposes its apartheid practices, and that is demanding justice for the Palestinians. This is the fact that this exists at all. This voice of the Democratic Party is a great breakthrough, and the fact that it is growing can only be beneficial. Now, with Joe Biden coming into the presidency next month, he is, of course, an avowed Zionist, as is the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. However, there is a strong wing of the Democratic Party that they will have to appease in order to accomplish anything. And this strong wing is increasingly pro-Palestinian and is increasingly critical, publicly and vocally critical, of the Israeli government and its practices. So Israel's plan for a greater Israel is certainly now in jeopardy. So that is a good thing.
Mr. Ellis, you may start. Is there is something someone is on the door, Mr. Robert, I think. You are unmute, Mr. Robert.
Yes. What was the question? Did you?
There was some bell ringing at your background.
Yes, I'm sorry. That was my clock. But I just want to say that I believe just to close off that Israel does certainly have a plan for greater Israel. It was proceeding with its plan quite successfully, unfortunately, but most of what Israel does is financed and allowed and enabled by the United States. But now with the Democratic Party coming into power and with this new wing in the Democratic Party increasingly critical of Israel, Israel's plans will not go smoothly. Hopefully they will not succeed at all. And this is this new vocal wing of the Democratic Party's progressively vocal wing is a good thing for the Palestinians.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Robert. Mr. Elias, I'll come to you now, but I'll twist a question for you. Like, do you think Middle East is helping Israel to achieve its greater Israel plan?
Let me first of all return a little bit to the questions, because I was not able to state a little bit my perspective. I found it a little bit short of my perspective. First of all, let us understand, first of all, why the West, and I'm not going to just to talk about the US, but on the West generally, and many countries, including India. Israel is serving a certain purpose for all of these countries as a laboratory to test high-tech, high technology, how to keep people quiet. With the Palestinians are basically guinea pigs for the high-tech industry, for the entire world. Israel is developing surveillance technology, is developing electronic fences. It is developing methods of coercing people, and the Palestinians are basically serving as the guinea pigs for that technology. There is a film by an Israeli filmmaker called The Laboratory, where he exactly presents that kind of case. So we have to understand that for many countries, Israel is fountain of high tech, how to keep their own populations under surveillance. This is a very important thing, which is completely ignored by most of the people who are discussing the state of Israel. The second thing is the so-called lip service given by Arab countries to the Palestinians. This is nothing new. It has existed since the establishment of the state of Israel. The Arab countries have always given lip service to the Palestinians. They have given them some money, but they have never wanted the Palestinians to become a revolutionary force in the Middle East. And when the Palestinians tried to present revolutionary ideas for one state in the 70s, the Arab countries intervened so in order to demand a two-state solution, which is basically a dead end. And that two-state solution, so-called, has been on the agenda for many years as a dead end, as a red herring, in order to keep the problem, the same problem in order. They don't want Palestine to become a one democratic country, because it could be very dangerous for all the countries around, because they would infect all the Arab populations of the idea of democracy. So this kind of view explains why many countries in the Arab countries do not want to support a just and lasting solution, but they want to support the corrupt Palestinian Authority as it is today. And I think it is very important that we state it here, that the Palestinians have today no representative. Those who are claiming to represent the Palestinians, Hamas on one side, and the Palestinian Authority, are not genuine representatives. They are corrupt organizations which are only work for their own benefits, and they benefit from Israeli tolerance. They get VIP cards to travel and so forth. And the Palestinians are being betrayed by their own leaders and also by the Arab countries. And I really hope that my message here as a Palestinian Jew is to call on everybody to support the genuine demands of the Palestinians, which is the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, sovereignty for Palestine from the sea to the Jordan, for one democratic country for all Palestinians, whether they are Jewish or Christians or Muslims. This is very important that this message comes through. And I would like just to warn everybody to put any hope in the American administration, whether Democratic or Republican. The Republicans and the Democrats have betrayed the Palestinian people since 70, 80 years. And I don't think that they will change today or tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you,
Next
Mr. Ellis.
question, Ahmad.
Yes, sir,
Hello.
please.
Okay. I have two more questions to ask. The other question is to Mr. Davidson and also to Mr. Robert, that Israel has offered Pakistan to resolve the Kashmir issue by mediating. So, whereas Israel themselves are involving in genocide in Palestine, so how can they do this? Because India is doing same genocide in Kashmir. So my question is it not a contradiction what they are offering to Pakistan?
Are you asking me?
Yes, please.
Well, I just can't find, if Israel is proposing to be kind of an arbiter or to join, I mean, to get India and Pakistan to discuss and settle the Kashmir issue, I find it's not only ludicrous, it's absurd, and it is completely out of this world. I think Pakistan has to tell Israeli, first clean up your own mess and give the Palestinians all their full rights, and then you can come to us and talk to us. I don't think that there is very much to say about that.
If I could,
Yes, Mr. Robert, please. I would like to rephrase a bit this question a bit in a way that Kashmir is known to be a nuclear flashpoint between two nuclear states. So this is the significance of Kashmir, and the humanity is suffering in Kashmir. And US and Israel both are offering us arbitration, and US has committed you had created humanitarian crisis in Middle East. Israel and US both are responsible for creating worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So how could they be adjustable in this all situation?
what Israel wants to do for India is the same thing the United States has done for Israel for many years. Sponsored meaningless and worthless negotiations. The Palestinians and Israelis negotiated for many years, and during that time, the Palestinians received nothing and the Israelis received everything. And this is the way the United States has wanted it. And now Israel is making the same or similar offer to Pakistan to negotiate this. The goal is not peace. The goal is not for them to, for the people of Kashmir to be free and independent. A government spokesman for India a year ago made the comment that this man said that we already have a model for how to handle Kashmir. The Israelis have done it successfully. Why don't we do it? We being India, and that's to do the same thing to Kashmir that Palestine or that Israel has done to Palestine for generations. Although other people have said what's happening in Kashmir right now is what has been happening in Palestine, but accelerated to it's happening faster. It's even more brutal, if that can be imagined. And this is what India wants to completely absorb Kashmir, and that's fine with Israel. So Israel will offer these meaningless negotiations. All that needs to happen for either the Kashmir issue to be resolved or the Palestinian issue is for India and Israel to adhere to international law. Negotiations aren't needed. They are counterproductive, but they are an excuse for those countries to avoid international law and continue with the policies that their governments want.
Thank you, Mr. Robert. I hope, Mr. Tauqir, you got your answer. Mr. Tauqir, we are unable to hear you. Could you please close?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, I can.
One more question is to Mr. Robert. Very well answered the question. The question is, don't you think that Israel is laying down a trap for Pakistan to mediate the Kashmir issue, but on the same time, they would like Pakistan to recognize Israel? And my question to both participants is, what shall Pakistan do in this abruptly changing geopolitical and geostrategic situation? Just your opinion, please.
Yes, Israel is putting Pakistan, and it knows it's doing that, into an uncomfortable position. Pakistan can refuse Israel purported aid. It's not real aid at all for negotiations, and then will be seen as not willing to talk about the issue, not willing to resolve it. Or it can, or Pakistan can walk into the trap and say, yes, we'll sit down and negotiate when there's nothing to negotiate. So Israel is attempting to put Pakistan into an awkward position. What Pakistan, I think the government of Pakistan must do is simply hold fast, recognizing human rights, recognizing international law, and continuing to support them, international law and human rights, rather than entering into some meaningless and worthless negotiations. And the government should say exactly that there is nothing to negotiate. This is not a situation for negotiations, it's a situation for international law.
Okay, Mr. Davidson, please, for your answer.
I would like to say the following thing. Pakistan has a Muslim population. And for Muslims, it is absolutely important to stand firm on the rights of the Muslims in Palestine. The Muslims are denied their human rights in Palestine. Most of the Palestinians are Muslims. They are exiled, they are oppressed. Pakistan, if it wants to, the Pakistani government, if it wants to remain legitimate and have credibility within its own population, which is Muslim, should stand by the Muslim Palestinian population and demand the right of return and all equal rights. If the Pakistani government is going to work in order to please America or Israel, it will alienate itself from the population in Pakistan. And I would say, as a Jew, I really hope that the Pakistani Muslim population will prevent its own government from recognizing Israel unless Israel is transforming itself into a democratic country, giving all the Palestinians their full human rights, equal rights within Israel as Israeli citizens, including the people of Gaza, including the Palestinian refugees. They could have all Israeli passports, but then the country, Israel, will stop being a Zionist country. It will become a democracy. I don't mind if it will call Israel or Palestine or whatever you want, but the content is very important. And I think that Pakistan can, without problem, keep simply to these ground rules of justice and peace without even feeling pressure, because I think it is very important for Pakistan to rely on its own population and press it, like Iran has been doing, not to recognize the Zionist entity. Unless it is de-Zionized, it becomes a democratic country in a peaceful country. And I think Pakistan could even do a lot of things in addition. It could, for example, invite Israelis and Palestinians who are working for one democratic country to come to Pakistan and hold conferences together in Pakistan, because Pakistan is one of the only countries with Iran which could serve as a host for such a plan. And I really call on the Pakistani people to work for that aim I do that as a Palestinian Jew.
Thank you.
Thank you
I
very
hope,
much.
Mr. Tauqir, you got the answer.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Robert Fantina and Mr. Elias Davidsson. I really appreciate your time.
Sir, excuse me, sir. Before ending it, I would like to pinch another question. It is for our audience, because we have discussed the past and the present. But let's talk a bit about future, because the U.S. administration, the newly elected U.S. administration, has not taken over the office yet. So it's too early to talk. But what could be the expectations of Palestinians or the people who are suffering from the newly elected U.S. administration? Because we have seen that Trump's peace negotiation plan has now slowed down, and it seems ineffective and inactive. So what do you think, how the president-elect's new administration will take this issue and deal with this all things? Mr. Robert, will you please start?
Certainly. There will be little change from the Trump administration. There will be some change. President-elect Biden has said that he will restart the support that the United Nations receives for Palestinian refugees. He wants to reopen the office of the PLO in Washington, D.C. So these are small things, but he has said that he will not move the U.S. embassy to Israel back to Tel Aviv, where it belongs. He said he disagreed with the move to Jerusalem, but as long as it's there, it might as well stay there. So he has said he is a personal friend of Benjamin Netanyahu. He is a Zionist himself. Kamala Harris, his vice president-elect, is also a Zionist. They speak at the AIPAC conventions every year, or conferences every year. So we're not going to see a significant difference. However, as I mentioned before, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is growing and will be at least an annoyance to the Biden administration on Palestine and on some other issues. Annoyance, how much bother and how much change they can bring about remains to be seen. I don't think it will be a huge amount, but it will be significant because it is something that was unheard of just a few years ago.
Thank you. Mr. Elias, what are your views? How you think, as Mr. Trump's family was in personal and family terms with Prime Minister Netanyahu? So what do you think, now the family is no more in power? So what do you think, what changes you expect in Middle East plan?
I find the question a little bit, I'm sorry to say, I find it a little bit funny. You see, the United States is an imperialist country. It is a criminal, political elite, and it is a rogue country, basically. The United States is a rogue country. So I don't expect from a rogue country to become Mother Teresa overnight. It's just a pipe dream. The solution to the Palestinian problem lies with the people in the area, in Israel and Palestine, with the support of good people around the world. But we cannot expect anything from the leaders of the Western countries. We cannot expect anything from them except to serve the big corporations and to serve their own interests. So therefore, I think I don't expect anything good coming from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. I think we have covered every aspect of Israel and the future, the present and the past. Mr. Tauqir, what do you think? I think we have taken very much long, and audience will hopefully enjoy it. And it was a great discussion for, I expect that for all of us. So your last words, Mr. Tauqir. So, Mr. Tauqir, please close your mic.
Excellent wordings from both Mr. Robert Fantina and Mr. Elias Davidsson. This is what I think.
Sir, mic bit closer to my mouth, sir.
Will show us. Yes, I just like to thank you, Mr. Robert Fantina and Elias Davidsson. Both have given their really deep input for this situation, and I hope that Pakistan, the government and the policymakers will understand which direction they shall move to, and I would rather say be careful what Israel is offering to Pakistan, because there is some agenda behind it, and we should understand what they are up to. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed and the discussion, and it will be fruitful for our audience. And it was a nice interaction. And hopefully, Mr. Robert and Mr. Elias, thank you so much for joining us. And now we'll beg the leave from our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.